Hello, welcome to Stageworthy. I'm Phil Rickaby, the host and producer of this podcast. Stageworthy is Canada's theatre podcast where I talk to theatre makers from all over Canada, some of whom you will have heard of before, and others I really think you should get to know. This week, my guest is Liz Buchanan. Liz is an actor, writer, and director, the artistic director of 9M Theatre, which puts on original and classical work in Hamilton, Ontario. She's written 3 plays, and mostly what we're going to talk about in this episode are her 2 fringe shows, Gnomes A Traumatic Comedy and Liz A Traumatic Comedy. So we'll get to that in just one second. First, I want to remind you, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you hit the subscribe button, like this episode, and if you have thoughts about it, make sure that you get in the comments and leave your comments there so I can respond and hear what you think about the episode. And also, if you've subscribed, make sure you hit that bell icon, because what that'll do is every time I drop an episode on YouTube, you'll get a notification that it's there. But if you're listening to the audio version, make sure that you're subscribed. Go to your favorite podcast app, search for Stageworthy, and hit the follow button. And also, if you have some thoughts with the episode, if you want to share those, in your podcast app, you will find a link to this episode on the Stageworthy website. And just click on that, and then you can leave your comments there. Here is my conversation with Liz Buchanan. Liz Buchanan, thank you so much for joining me. It is a pleasure to finally be talking to you. You are an actor, writer, director based in Hamilton, and your theater company is 9M Theatre. And we were just before we hit the record, but we were talking about in 2023 and the Hamilton Fringe, you had a show called Gnomes A Traumatic Comedy. And this past year at the Hamilton Fringe, you had a show called Liz A Traumatic Comedy. Let's talk a little bit about each of those shows. Let's talk about Gnomes, A Traumatic Comedy, and then move on to Liz.
Sounds good. No, yeah. So in 2023, my play was called Gnomes, A Traumatic Comedy, which was, it was a play. I always said it was my favorite tagline. It's about gnomes, obviously. And it certainly to some extent was, but the play was pretty obviously autobiographical in a way I hadn't really tried to hide, especially. The main character's name was Ellie Cannon, which like at that point, people kind of could probably catch on that it was, but I cleverly disguised her as a visual artist. So the whole premise of this play, oh yeah, there was nothing subtle going on. And the premise was that she normally was an artist, but she'd had something sort of really difficult happen to her. And rather than actually dealing with the trauma involved in the sort of bad thing that had happened in her life, she was making gnomes to cope with it. So instead of making her usual art, she's making gnomes. And so a huge amount of the play was kind of both filled with seeing all these various gnomes that she made, which involved a lot of really terrible gnome puns. There were gnome puppets reenacting various scenes from theater, and there was an entire section that was Gnome Kill Bill in the middle. And then the play sort of led up to this point where her trying to like reclaim her visual art style. She eventually repaints a bunch of classical works of art, but with gnomes in them. So there's like Vincent Van Gnome, which is the classic, like Van Gogh with his ear chopped off, which was the poster. The Birth of Venumus, which was like Venus in the clamshell, but like it was a gnome coming out of the clamshell. It like really silly, funny, over the top stuff in the play, and that made it an easy sell. But of course, there's a bit of a dark side to the play as well, which is
Sure, as in my opinion, any show with a silly premise should have some kind of like underlying something to justify a twist, so there's not just silliness all the way through.
Well, and so the twist is that this artist is dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it was a huge sort of examination and obvious, again, like I said, it wasn't exactly thinly veiled. It was some of the stuff I was going through in my own life of trying to figure out how to make art with these sort of barriers that were now in my way because of mental illness, dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder myself, and sort of not wanting my art to kind of take over this like horrible darkness all the time. Because you don't want something to be entirely silly, but you also don't want something to be entirely dark and miserable. Nobody wants to look at that, I think is one of the lines I have in the play.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then, so what's kind of interesting about the reason I called it Liz a Traumatic Comedy is that 2 years later, I think I felt more like it could put a bit more of the darkness out there. And it got a little bit more personal in a way that it hadn't. And I actually kind of shared my closer to my real story about what had gone on. Obviously, not with a lot of detail. Like I said, Gnomes, nobody really wants to look at that. But sort of talked about some of those darker places that I'd actually gone to. And I think it was important. What I kind of wanted to share with that was we want art to be healing, and that can be really meaningful for people, but what that actually looks like, because I think people have like an idea of what that form that might take, and at least what it took for me.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think that art should be healing. I don't think it should be therapy. And it's always like that danger with like a solo show, right? Like I've had people pitch show, you're in back when people would flyer in lines, you'd be in a line and somebody would start a pitch. You'd be like, I can't tell if this is a play or therapy.
And that was actually, we were saying that right before the recording started. This was a hard show to pitch, trying to convince people. I promise I did the therapy. Veronica would have done that piece already. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't trap you in a theater for therapy at you.
Yeah.
That said, it was more therapeutic than I expected it to be. I was surprised actually because I certainly didn't go in with that, boy, do I ever want to like therapize myself with this, but it had some therapeutic elements to it that were kind of cool, that were nice.
Yeah. Before we get into that, because I certainly can relate from my own show, The Commandment. I wouldn't say therapy in it, but there was a lot of catharsis in it, which was really quite satisfying to be part of and to experience. But I do want to talk about Gnomes A Traumatic Comedy first, because it was the first of the duology. And I'm curious about what drew you to Gnomes.
I talk about this a little bit in Liz A Traumatic Comedy. I actually have had a bit of a weird obsession with gnomes. I was obsessed when I was very, very little with Fraggle Rock. If you're familiar with that TV show, big Muppet fan in general, but like I was just like the right age when Fraggle Rock came out to be like really, really fixated on Fraggles. And there's an episode in it where Doc, the guy who lives, the silly creature, the human that lives in the Fraggle world, that connects Fraggle Rock to us, he has a job where he has to repaint garden gnomes. So there's this whole episode where he's like painting them, and Uncle Traveling Matt comes along and sees him doing this, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so it's the point, less Fraggle mythology, more to my point. I thought it was so great, this idea of like painting these gnomes, and that would be, so much fun. So I like begged my mom for a garden gnome. I please, I have to have a garden gnome. I'm 3, right? And my mom's always being super supportive and so wonderful, lovely woman. But for reasons I can't begin to comprehend, she didn't want us to get a garden gnome. She thought they were tacky or something. It's hard to imagine why she wouldn't want one. But she sort of put her foot down and she says, when you have your own house, you can have a garden gnome. And I said, this is my house. And I thought that was so cute. She bought me a garden from spite of my mother.
You won!
I know.
You won!
So the gnome did he made an appearance in Liz, A Traumatic Comedy. The OG gnome. But like,
were you ever presented with the Brian Froud book Gnomes?
No, I've got the Renee Pourvalet.
Okay, maybe that's it. I may have been confusing the two.
It's like a Danish artwork that's all like gnomes obsessed. For reference, Archer references it in a read a coffee table book, I believe is his line in the Archer episode.
Right. Yes. Yeah. There's a book, and I can't remember who wrote it or who illustrated it. And it just has like a gnome and a red hat on the cover. There's a reprint of it with a blue cover, but it was originally on a white. And again, very, those kinds of books were very influential to a certain generation of children, if not influential, certainly nightmare inducing in many ways.
They're a little eerie in that particular rendition, and you see like a wide variety of gnome styles too. That was actually part of with gnomes, like creating Ellie's gnomes, what they would look like, trying to create a really distinct style for them that was different than, because gnomes have really blown up the last few years. Like you find them in souvenir shops and like gift
Yeah.
shops and stuff all over the place. But even at the time, there's like styles of them that are very commercial and very popular that I was trying to make sure that hers looked really distinctive and different from what we'd seen. But that is something I noticed, is that there's a lot of different kind of variations on gnome styles.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it'd be pretty boring if they were if it was all the same. I was curious about gnomes, about whether it went beyond the garden gnome and into the mythology.
Not as much as it probably should. I'm more into it a little bit now. In the play, I made references that I've been wanted to do for a long time, which is play D&D. And I did eventually take up as a D&D. I play as a gnome, then gave the character name Ellie Wick, so she goes by Ellie for short.
Nice, nice.
That is, I'm a little bit more into at least the D&D sort of mythology lore around gnomes. But yeah, so I'm a little bit, I'm probably a little dull when it comes to the really like interesting like mythology pieces around that.
The D&D stuff often draws from the mythologies,
Yeah.
right? So they don't start from a blank slate. They usually draw from the mythologies. I want to move from gnomes to Liz, which is a weird thing to say, Liz.
Well,
It's weird to say something like, I want to go from gnomes to Liz.
I feel like that's what I've said to myself when I decided to change the. Go on.
So now you've gone from Gnomes A Traumatic Comedy to Liz A Traumatic Comedy. You said that you felt like ready to sort of address stuff. How was it putting that stuff on the stage? And you sort of alluded to trying to find the pitch for it. How did that go throughout the Hamilton Fringe?
I mean, there were a lot of different stages of that process. One thing that really helped from the get-go, the same director, so David Faulkner Rundle's a friend of mine, and a director around Hamilton and stuff. And he directed Gnomes Traumatic Comedy. I asked him sort of right out the gate, would you direct Liz A Traumatic Comedy? And I think even he sort of was laughing a little bit at the beginning of like, so you want me to direct you on how you're going to tell your story? But I think some of that was that tone piece of, I think it definitely needs a filter to go through, and somebody that I can bounce this off of like, how is this reading? How does this sound? Is this creating the effect I want it to create, as opposed to just, yeah, I think it would be easy. It would be too easy to just stand up and be like, well, I'm just going to tell my story. That could backfire in a lot of ways. And I think
Sure.
I really wanted to make sure that I had like somebody that I was running as a director. And then I did it in front of a few friends before I actually put it on stage to make sure like I was getting that practice of how is this going to play off of different people.
Yeah, you certainly do need the outside eye, and especially when you're like crafting it, putting it up on its feet. Because otherwise, like, you don't know if you're just like looking indulgent or if it's working the way you hope it does. You don't. It's better to have that outside eye to help you make sure that you're saying what you want to be saying.
It's one of those times I think the insecurity came in handy for this. And I'm not saying I struck a perfect balance. I'm sure there were elements of it that were more self-indulgent than I wanted, or might have been more like difficult for people to sit with than I would have liked. But I think that constant critical thinking about like, how is this self-indulgent? Is this too dark? Is this too difficult at these points? Being able to like constantly run that by people and count on them to be fairly honest with you about it was definitely helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I'm curious, as somebody who has written and performed two solo shows, I'm curious about what drew you to creating and performing a solo show.
Yeah, I mean, it's become very popular in Fringe right now for a few reasons. I certainly like it. It does, yeah. It's easier to mount and manage, particularly well, I shouldn't say post-pandemic, particularly since the lockdowns. in the pandemic-stricken world we live in. That sort of challenge of making sure you've got a small cast group and not sort of a glutted show. There's some advantages there. I suppose it was also because you've been seeing a lot of solo shows and exposed to that a lot. It does give you inspiration. I always think Fringe is really cool for whether they're I shouldn't say bad shows, whether they're great shows or shows in progress. You learn something from all of them, and then they do kind of inspire you to this is okay. Well, could I do that? What would that look like if I did a version of that? And seeing that many solo shows over the last couple of years, you think, okay, I think I could do that. I think I could tell a story here that would go start to finish.
Yeah,
and hold people.
for sure. So solo shows are always that, like, especially for touring artists, it's like the costs are really low on that. We don't have a big cast, and it doesn't take long for a touring show, like, to get to a big cast. Like 3 is kind of big for like touring. You have all kinds of logistics, and if it's just a solo show, just a solo show. If it's a solo show, those logistics are a little easier. Do you remember like what the first solo show that you were exposed to was, and how did that happen at a Fringe, or did you read a solo show?
Yeah, do you know what? This is funny because one of the podcasts I re-listened to that you had done was with my friend Carlin Ramey. And I am actually pretty sure Sarah was the first solo show I ever saw.
Interesting. I
think that might have been the first one. I was in I think it was tech for another show in Fringe that summer. And it just looked, Carlin's pitch at the kickoff party really caught my eye because I'd also just come back from a trip. So Carlin's show is about they're traveling around Europe and in particular Great Britain and Ireland, and that I had just come back from a trip of Scotland and London, and so I think that really resonated with me, and so I made a point to go out to see it, and I do it. And there's an arrogance in me that was like, I could do that. With all due respect to Carlin, who is so brilliant at it and so talented. And I'm not anywhere near there yet, but I say that there's an arrogant part of my brain that's like, tried that.
Listen, I think for a lot of people who are performers, who are creators, who are making theater, especially if you're making independent theater, especially Fringe, there's like, that is like the great, like, I could do that. Like, it's inspiring, but also like, I think it comes from a place of not competition, but like, I see what they're doing with that. I want to do that. I want to experience that.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, when I say it's an arrogance thing, I think it's that hilarity of like both knowing, wow, this person's so talented at doing this. If I could push, of like, and so you're questioning yourself of like, what would it take for me to kind of like get to that stage? And I'm certainly nowhere near that. Carlin was actually somebody I went to meet with and talk with when I was developing this, right? That's somebody that I know, like, I respect their work a lot. And I think they're really valuable.
Well, Carlin has such a relaxed and personable and charismatic presence on the stage that is uniquely hers. Yeah. I don't think there's many people who do, because she's kind of herself in a way on stage that's like very representative of who she seems to be. And so, like, I remember walking into the theater and she was already on the stage greeting people as they came in. And me, I'm doing my show and I'm like, I don't want to see people until it's time to do the show. And she's just like, looking at people as they come in.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong. I actually don't think I've seen either of your shows, but you're a character though, yeah.
Yes. And she's like telling a story about herself.
Yeah.
Essentially. Yeah.
No, and there was, believe me, about, I don't know, it probably would have happened faster. I was in another show right before Fringe. And then as soon as that show finished, I had this sensation hit me of, what have you done? Why is this so personal? What's wrong with you? That I'm sure I was trying to avoid by being in like a bunch of other shows before Fringe came. But I absolutely had that sensation about 2 weeks before Fringe. I thought, why? Why did you think it was a good idea to put yourself on stage? Carlin, it's no problem. Carlin, they're awesome. So why would Carlin put themselves on stage? Like,
I will admit to you that I was so confident when I was doing my show, The Commandment, the first time. Like, I was so confident in the days leading up to the first performance. I had a whole plan that day. I was going to I was going to see a couple of shows, and then I was going to go take myself out for some food before the show. Then I'd do the show, and it'd be awesome. And then I woke up the morning of, and it was the first time I'd performed the show. And I was like, I'm going to vomit today. So everything went out the window. So it was like very much like, I just have to concentrate on this. I can't do any of the other things. So it's like, once you're faced with the thing and it's so close, it becomes it can be really daunting, especially as a solo performer.
I imagine too, because whether it had been personal or not, I do sort of think that some of that, like the buck stops at you with it for sure.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, if people don't if you're a solo performer and you wrote that show, if people don't like that show, they don't like your performance, they don't like your writing, they basically don't like you. So there's a lot of pressure.
That was exactly what was going through my head. And I thought that was special to the fact that it was personal. See, we should have done this. I should have talked to you in some capacity.
I think that it has a lot to do with, especially if it's your first time doing a solo show.
I was so sure. I was having that thought that I'm like, well, that's it. If they don't like this, it's not about your performance, it's about you. You're bad.
I mean, I think, honestly, especially if the show is untried, right? You've shown it to some friends, but it hasn't been in front of an audience yet. That is like, the tension of that, because, I know those people. They're a friendly audience. They'll tell me if it sucks, but, this is real. And there is certainly something about that. And so until it is a tried and tested performance or show, like an audience, a real audience that paid money sees it, there's sort of like I don't know, for me, there was a bit of a doubt, like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Yeah.
No, and I think too, there's the people I did it for, by and large, like, because they're your friends, it also meant that they kind of knew a certain amount of those stories and a certain amount of like what I was talking about. There were some things that were new to certain people, but I would say everybody I showed for ahead of time, to some degree, had some knowledge of what I was going to talk about in advance, which also changes that, right? And it also changes the reception of it. So there was definitely that thought of like, well, I think this is interesting. And my friends who have been putting up with some version of this show for a few years now think this is interesting, but would anybody else, right?
I mean, that is the thing that a lot of times, especially with Fringe, and especially with the solo show at Fringe, you don't know until that audience comes in. It makes those early performances so stressful.
Yeah, it probably took me, I would say, well, I had smaller audiences for the first two. Again, I think some of that was that like difficulty in marketing it. There were more than a couple of my friends that I said to him, like, you admit you wouldn't see this if it wasn't me. If somebody had this description, you would be like, oh, I don't want to go see this. And I knew that. So there's this tricky thing. It was almost the reverse of Gnomes, where like, so Gnomes, I'm selling this sort of like cute, like they're gnomes and it's going to be fun and they're silly antics. And on some level, there's a little bit of a bait and switch there, admittedly, because you get it and then there's some dark stuff. This one, the dark stuff's up front. It's trying to convince people, no, I swear, when you get in there, I promise a lot of it's funny. I promise. A lot of it's fun and funny, I swear. I wouldn't do that to you. But trying to convince people of that was tricky for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But one thing I'm curious about, because, you could do one solo show and you could be like, that's it, I'm done. I did it. I did a solo show. And you did a second. And I don't know about for you, but for me, after performing my solo show the first time, I was addicted. I was like, oh, I want to do solo shows. I want to create solo shows. I want to create other kinds of things too, but solo shows are this thing where you were the one, you wrote the words, you're taking the audience through this journey. It's like you're holding them in the palm of your hand as you're taking them through your journey. But what I'm curious about was, so you had this show, Gnomes A Traumatic Comedy, which was not a solo show. You had a whole cast, somebody who's playing you, you had somebody who's playing your brother. And then what made you want to create a solo show?
Yeah. So I think when it became a little bit more personal, for sure. And I think some of it was kind of pulling up that veil. Like Gnomes was pretty thinly veiled. It was going to be pretty obvious to anybody who watched that it was about me. But there were some things I kept at a distance specifically, and that was intentional at the time. It's where I was at the time too, with my kind of journey with everything. I needed that space to be distant from it. But I think when it was going to become that personal, and I was going to tell what actually happened that involved sort of like the PTSD and the trauma, there were pieces of that were way more interesting. And I don't mean in like a dark, traumatic way. It's just like there were just some really interesting things that happened that I couldn't write. Like just bizarre pieces of my own story that were connected to this that like it's that stranger than fiction thing. It would seem not real on stage, and there was this sort of odd thing of being somebody who fancies themselves a writer and sitting on that story level. You're like, there's got to be a way I can tell it. And I think that had to be me then. If it wasn't going to be sort of this like, I didn't want to do a like, this is Liz's life that was that. But I did want to like, I think if I was going to tell my stories, I wanted to tell my stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, the question that comes from that for me then is, how do you feel about solo performing now? Like, do you have it out of your system, or is it something you want more of? Or was this like, I did it this once with this show, this is the only one I'm going to do?
No, to be honest, I think the thing I was getting out of my system as much as anything was that story about myself that I think, and there were a lot of stories, and it certainly wasn't just about the PTSD and recovery around that. There's sort of like a lot of like different life stories that I was telling, and it was different experiences that I've had in my life. And I feel like I've told that now, like what I would like to share of myself that I think is interesting and funny and helpful and cathartic and whatever. But it wouldn't put me off of doing a creative solo show, a fiction solo show.
I mean, if you look at somebody like Carlin's on, I think, their third show. Third show to take him to. Unless there's a fourth, it's possible. Carlin is prolific.
Yeah, Carlin had something or other. During the lockdown years when we were doing virtual Fringe, that I did see called Chaotic Good, but I know
right.
Sarah, which I think is now, if I've understood this correctly, Love and Craig is the updated title for that, which is what's in Vancouver, and then ADHD Project and Scaredy Cat, and then I think the fourth one was that nebulous one.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask about, we've been talking about the PTSD and things like that, and about your shows about trauma. I am fascinated. In fact, I would say that most of the things that I write are stories about, I describe it as, it's not necessarily the right, I don't know if it's the right way to do it, but a lot of the characters in the plays that I write are broken people who learn how to put themselves back together. And you mentioned about, there's shows about trauma, but not a lot about picking up the pieces and putting one's life back together. And that is a big thing for you in terms of creating this show. Talk to me about how important that is to you.
Yeah. Well, now I'm really sorry I haven't seen your solo shows, because I do think that like there's I think people do avoid talking about sort of big, dark issues sometimes because you feel like it's going to be burdensome to people. And there's certainly possible for it to be that, but then I think what we avoid talking about is what that looks like on kind of the healing end of it. And there's a lot of shows about broken people. There's just so much media, TV shows, et cetera, about broken people. And I don't think anywhere near enough about where what does that actually look like? And I this actually came out to me partly because I was looking for it. You're looking to connect with stuff and people. It's both a very boring and unique experience when something really awful happens. And PTSD, I think I liken it to grief a lot, where you feel very alone and isolated from everybody else, which is so weird because everybody else is actually going through like who among it doesn't have something like that grief or that darkness or whatever. And it's such a strange sensation to feel like you're isolated from everybody with it. So then you're kind of like looking for, okay, well, who's come out on the other end of this, or what the story about coming out on the other end of this. And normally what I would find were the stories that kind of stopped at, look how broken this person is now because of this horrible thing that happened. And you don't want the story to be the therapy necessarily, but I think it's also just kind of nice sometimes when you can feel like you're connecting with something that isn't just stopping at that, like, yeah, I'm broken and crushed and everything is nothing's ever going to be okay again.
Which is a terrible place to leave your audience. Like, hey, good night. Have a great night, everybody.
Well, an enormous amount of media does that or brushes over it. I think that'd be other kind of things that I noticed a lot in trying to watch and just find things that I could kind of connect with. It's a weird sort of thing. As much as you would think you would kind of not want to think about the darkness or whatever it is, whether it's grief or trauma or whatever, I actually found myself really trying to seek out stuff like that. It just you're nothing else made sense to me for a stretch of time in my life where there was so much, it was taking up a big presence in my life. And on one hand, no, you don't want it to define you, but also it's there.
I mean, the thing is that, like, no, you don't want it to define you, but for a period of time, it kind of does. It's the thing that takes over your mind. And so it's the thing, right? And so that is a fact. But I also think that it is important to tell stories about it, and also stories about people who are coming through it, because everybody goes through it at some point. Everybody goes through some kind of trauma, some kind of grief, some kind of something terrible. And it's good to see media and plays and things that show you that there is a way through.
No, for sure. And like, even I was trying to think about, and like, there's definitely media and shows that you see that where somebody's maybe not dealing with it in like healthy or great ways. And it doesn't mean like it will invalidate those. One of my favorite all-time TV shows is Jessica Jones, and like,
right,
broken as you can get. And there's not a lot of good blueprints laid out and for what this might look like.
Right. Yeah.
In a healthier version, it stays pretty dark throughout it. So I think there's room for that kind of media that deals with it very, like, honestly and frankly. But I also think it's it's naive to think you can get over it easily, but it's a little too cynical for my taste to decide that you can't get over it at all.
I fully agree. And I think that, it is a journey, and it is something that takes time, and you can't get over it overnight, but like, the journey has, like, you can get it. And you're right. It's cynical to be like, you're broken.
Yeah.
Good luck.
I felt that way for a long time, right?
I'm sure
with that for even as I'm trying to like navigate the more like and draw myself out of it, and even with like, I'd have good days and bad days for a long time, and I'm sure I'm still gonna have bad days from time to time, but I'm certainly on a. It doesn't feel like it's unfixable now in the way that maybe 2 years ago even it did.
Whereas creating these shows, I don't want to ask if they were your therapy, but were they helpful in dealing with the PTSD?
Yeah, this one more so than Gnomes. So I think that was the other thing that was sort of interesting to me when people were like, "Oh, it must be therapeutic or whatever to write this," and I thought, I don't know, and I wasn't counting on it. So Gnomes, we got on a bunch of Critics' Choice lists, and it was really well acclaimed, and people liked it better than Liz, A Traumatic Comedy. I'm not surprised. That piece of it doesn't surprise me. I actually remember thinking, well, it's probably the best thing I'm ever going to write. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But I was aware of that being a good piece of art that I was really proud of. But I don't think I came out of the other end of that feeling any better than I had going into it. This one, so then I had very low expectations to feel that way with this one as well. It was just the story that I sort of felt compelled to tell for a lot of different reasons. And you're also trying out different stuff around like, well, what could my art look like now going forward, and how am I channeling this, and what are the different ways I could try to channel these pieces of me. this had a tangible positive effect because it ended on such an optimistic note. It's that idea, if you say something enough, you start to believe it.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's not that I didn't believe, I'm writing, I'm never doing it again. I'll spoil the ending of the play. I had a line in it where I've talked a lot about sort of the complexities of justice and kind of where I come at that from. And my line is that justice isn't about him getting what he deserves. It's about me getting what I deserve. And I deserve some time on stage in the spot. And people clapping at that was really moving for me, where I'm like, oh, I don't feel like I deserved that. But also there's a part where you're like, oh, yeah, okay, it's true. Like this, it starts to become true. It starts to become a reality for you in that way of like, that might sound a little overly optimistic, and yeah, it's glossing over some darker pieces of that, but like there's also some real truth to that of healing and moving forward with your life. And I think doing that over and over again and having such a lovely audience response to it made it more real for me than it was when I wrote it.
It's kind of amazing the way that theater can do that, huh? Like you went through this with the audience, and doing it together sort of like brings a moment to you. And I think that's why sometimes people fall into the therapizing of their theater because of that. And it's magic when it happens, but I think it becomes a little dangerous when you end up trying to manufacture it.
Yeah, so you also then hope, you're like, oh well, I hope that I hope that was mutually beneficial.
100%. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, like, I don't, well, I hope this isn't just about people feeling like they need to lift me up at the end of it, because part of the point of that line was to be like, I am lifted up, but the other side of that was, oh wow, doing that and saying that and taking that power back for myself really was actually quite effective in that way for me. So yeah, hopefully it felt like a mutual power exchange there with the audience.
I think that we can feel it as performers, especially when you're alone. You have a connection with the audience when you're doing a solo show. I think you can feel it if it's not genuine, right? I think it's like watching people like do like a fake standing ovation where people feel like they should, a couple people stand up, then other people stand up, then other people stand up. You can feel that it's like, it's not genuine. And I think as performers, we do have a sense of it.
Yeah. I was joking with a couple of my friends that I don't know that they would have stood up if the audience hadn't been standing up.
Right. Yeah.
Well, your friends at theater people, they've got a much higher bar for the
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I called a few of them. I'm like, you only stood up because everybody else.
No, you just take it. Just take it. Just take it. I did want to ask you about, I know that, you've been acting for most of your life. You've been directing. Being able to call yourself a writer and have that be meaningful. Years ago, someone called me out on the fact that when somebody asked me what I did, I described myself by my day job and not as a writer. When pretty much all of my free time in when I wasn't doing my day job was involved with writing in some way. And there had been a block for me about being able to say the words, I'm a writer. For you, it was like you were writing, and then what prevented you from calling yourself a writer?
Did I not call myself a writer in the bio either?
No,
because I'm usually bad.
Here's the thing: you specifically said that you only recently started to consider yourself a writer.
For me.
You said,
sorry, I couldn't remember what I'd written to you.
Yeah.
No, that is correct. I would say, I felt more confident in the directing and acting. I did not do well in creative writing in most of school. Like, I would get, like, I very rarely got good marks, and I always wanted to. Like, I wanted to be good at it. And I've gone back and written some of the stuff. I didn't deserve to get good marks. I look at it and I'm like, oh, that was awful. Like, I wrote some truly terrible stuff when I was a teenager, as I'm sure we all do. But that didn't help. So I think for a long time, I knew I was very sensitive about my writing. that I would very rarely let people read it, and I knew I wasn't good at taking criticism about it. That I would get very defensive because I did have that insecurity. Whereas my acting, not that I'm never like, I'm sure my acting director, I get defensive and insecure from time to time, but like I would say most of the time, if I'm getting feedback, I know it's to improve my craft. And I've got a confidence about both of those things that I don't think it's not going to crush my spirit if somebody thinks I did bad in a scene. Whereas I think with writing, I was at a stage for a long time where I didn't trust myself with it. Another one of my friends you had on your podcast, Ryan Ciro, was a huge help with this. I started sending him a lot of stuff over the lockdowns, and he knew that about me. So he, I think, was very gentle with his feedback for a really long time with me in a like just a positive, I'm going to build this person up kind of way, and then gradually started getting a little bit more like he would send me stuff that was a little bit more like, well, why don't you try that? Why don't you try that? But he was quite, I think he made a point of sort of helping build me up with it and be very encouraging. I would say, though, I wasn't willing to call myself a writer until Gnomes because the writing in particular received a lot of good reviews. And I knew when I wrote it, that was the first time I could have taken negative feedback on it. Because when I wrote it, I thought, oh, I know this is good. Like, that sounds really arrogant, but I'm like, I know this is good enough that if somebody wants to give me feedback on it, they're trying to challenge and make it better. Not because this is a bad piece of writing, but like the feedback is, well, why don't you try this? Why don't you try this? Not, you need to scrap this whole thing. It's garbage.
I think that there is a measure of confidence that comes from being able to take that kind of like to take criticism, to know that the work that you created was good, and to be able to just sort of be like, sure, if some people don't like it, that's fine. And to be like, but most people do.
So do you call yourself a writer now?
All the time.
Excellent.
All the time. And it was after that person called me out and was like, you never say that you're a writer. You always talk about your day job, but you are not your day job. And I was like, shit, they're right. And so it's on everything now. It's like one of the defining descriptors.
The biggest imposter syndrome I still get about it is that I'm not a writer with good habits. So I do know a lot of the time when people talk about like what would make you a good writer, you've got to do it every day. And I am absolutely one of those people that does it in fits and starts. I'd be better at it if I made myself practice. I'd be better at it if I wasn't as like, if I didn't curate it as much as I do, like just let it be bad and then come back to it some other time. All those things that I think would make me better at it, I should do. But
sure. But you're still a writer. And that's the thing. I want to talk a little bit because we've barely talked about 9M Theater.
Yes.
Which is, I know we have to take care of that. Which is a theater company that puts on a mix of original and modern work, as well as small intimate productions of Shakespeare classics. So tell me about 9M Theater and where it came from.
The title 9M, because I cast somebody because they asked me what that was.
Tell me.
The 9 Muses. My friend Rebecca, she's the only person, it was my very first show, and she was the only person that was like, where's 9M come from? That was how we became friends. Yeah, it's the 9 Muses from like the Greek mythology. So the drama and comedy mask are Melanope, I think I always say her name wrong, and Talia are the drama and comedy. But there's, of course, the 9 Muses. And I was originally going to call it 9 Muses Theater, and then found out that there's a 9 Muses Masonic temple in the UK. And I thought, I probably don't want to run afoul of the Masons.
You probably don't want to get run afoul of the Masons now.
No. So 9M was kind of my clever way of getting around that. And that came out of an equal amount of arrogance of watching people have small independent theater companies around Hamilton. I mean, let's probably do that.
Was there like something in particular you wanted to do that made you want to do it, or just like you kind of wanted to join the club?
Yeah, funnily enough, this is funny because there's so much of it now. There was a very short period of time where there wasn't a lot of Shakespeare in Hamilton. And this city loves Shakespeare. Like, I don't even know how to tell you, like, you put on a Shakespeare show and you will sell out at least one performance. Like, I don't know what it is about the city and Shakespeare, but they really, really love it. And I'm a fan too. I just come back from the UK right around the time we saw Carlin's show. But it just come back from the UK. I did a couple of variations of, so I saw West End Romeo and Juliet, which is terrific. I saw Macbeth at the Globe, which was incredible. And then I saw A Much Ado About Nothing, done by this tiny little company in a little courtyard that was all like low budget. And it was incredible. I loved it so much. Not to diminish the Globe one of the West End one, but in some ways I was like, I think that one might be my favorite. And it does kind of get your brain going of like, yeah, you don't necessarily need a huge crew. And Ryan Ciro, who runs Make Art Theater, also does a lot of like sort of small scale Shakespeare like that as well. So it's, there's no production rights. There's no production rights. It is, you can do it in sort of small scale if you're creative enough. And I think it then poses a really interesting challenge to you as a director if you're creative enough. And it's a city both full of like people who love Shakespeare, but also it's full of Shakespearean actors. Like, I don't know. Again, I don't know what it is about the city. I think you'd cast 3 Shakespeare plays at the same time and not of people who are pretty competent at it. So
Nice.
it seemed like let's take advantage of that. And so let's put on King Lear once again with just as much arrogance as I could have stumbled into.
Sure, the easiest one.
Exactly.
The easiest one, King Lear.
Yep. Just with the real theme of this podcast seems to be Liz's arrogance.
We'll subtitle it.
My brother is participating in most of the shows, and he's obviously like being a lot behind the scenes when he's sort of not there. And Lear was one actually. I was mean. I tricked him into doing Lear because he's not a big Shakespeare kid, but he does stage combat. And he's quite a talented actor. And but he's a lawyer full time, so he's very, very busy. But I said to him, I think I've got a part for you, Lear. Don't worry, it's a pretty small role. Now, this is Edgar, the rightful. Yeah, okay, I'm glad you're laughing. For anybody listening to this that is not familiar, it's a huge role.
It is not a small part.
No,
that is not a small part. So you lied.
I did. I fully tricked him into being in the show, and then he was stuck with me for doing my shows forever. Oh yeah, it was a little deceitful. There's no two ways about it, but he liked doing
it. What actor doesn't want a big part and a good juicy part too?
No, and he is terrific in that. I think he was so good in that role, nepotism side.
Yeah.
I would say he was really talented in that, and I have now totally forgotten why I started telling that story about tricking my brother into being in my play.
Oh, we were just talking about 9M theater and doing Shakespeare and things like that. That's listen, I think you were talking about how you got started and you did King Lear, and that's how that came.
Oh yeah, I was going to tell the story about my brother saying to me, one of the papers described my decision to start with King Lear as ambitious. And so, without missing a beat, quotes Julius Caesar, ambition should be made of sterner stuff. I don't think he's wrong. I've obviously been able to pull off most of it, but I do bite off more than I can chew sometimes with the company.
As people who make theater, especially independent theater, this is what we do. This is what who hasn't bitten off more than they could chew, especially for Fringe. Especially doing independent theater, you just make it happen, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned something near the beginning of our conversation, and I've allowed it to go uncommented on until now. And we're sort of coming to the last 10 minutes of the show, and I cannot let this go by when you just casually mentioned that you're a Muppets fan. And Fraggle Rock. I was a Muppet Show guy because I'm an old man. The Fraggles started, I was in the 80s somewhere, so I was in my teens, a little too old for the Fraggles, but I was aware. But I love Muppets. If you want to make me cry, you have Kermit sing Rainbow Connection, or you show me the video of Kermit the Frog singing It's Not Easy Being Green at Jim Henson's funeral, and I'm gone for the day.
Right.
So, from one Muppets fan to another, do you have a favorite Muppets project, and who is your favorite Muppet?
Yeah. I mean, Fraggle Rock near and dearest to my heart just because I grew up with it, and it probably is. Yeah, I think I just used to watch this. We had them all videotaped on VHSs off of the TV. Look it up if you're young and listening. I used to just watch them over and over on repeat. So it's hard to. I guess it's if I had to go a second choice. I've had to go a second on that. It is the little-known Muppet Family Christmas. So it's not the Muppet Christmas Carol, but the Muppet Family Christmas, which is a whole thing where they all go to Fozzie's mom's house for the holidays. And it's like all of the Muppets and all of the Fraggles and all of the Sesame Street characters. Everybody just converges on this place. And
Watch out for that patch of ice.
careful of the icy patch.
Yep. Yep.
We watch that.
Now-
we still watch that every year, my family.
Now, that's not the one where they basically do the plot of It's a Wonderful Life?
No, that's a 2001 one.
That's okay. Yeah. That's another Muppet Christmas thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Muppets and Christmas kind of go together nicely
They
because
kind of do. I mean, you got the Emmett Otter's Christmas as well, which is fun. Especially some of the bloopers are great.
my favorite thing in Fraggle Rock is that they don't have a Christmas special. They have a pagan holiday solstice special.
Right. Yes.
Because of course the Fraggles, like they've got their own culture.
It doesn't make sense for them to have a Christmas episode at all.
And it's also meant to be this kind of universal, like they showed it in all different countries and all over the world. And the idea was supposed to be that it would translate. So this idea of like a solstice festival makes sense. And they just sort of cut out anything particularly Christmassy about it. You see, plus or minus the symbolism.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite Muppet, and has it changed in recent years?
See, it's always been pretty consistent. Miss Piggy's the drama queen and
Got it.
but like and the girl Muppet for the most part. Like that's that for sure. I think that's I have to sort of resonate a bit with Miss Piggy. Fraggles was I went through all the different Fraggles, having different favorite ones, and like would be a different one for Halloween every year. But I have a real warm spot in my heart for Red because she's quite sort of loud and boisterous, and my favorite color is red. But one of the coolest things I think I found out, the puppeteer, I believe it's Karen Prell, who was the puppeteer for Red, made a switch to video game design in sort of the mid 2000s and did all the designs on Portal 2, the bad guy in Portal 2. She was like the lead designer for that and worked for Valve for a while, which I thought was really cool because I would say that is one of my favorite video games of all time. So
there you go. There you go. Full circle. Full circle. I was a Kermit guy for so long. I think I'm leaning more towards Gonzo lately, and maybe that's because of he's the lead in the most accurate version of A Christmas Carol, and also he's a weirdo, and I really kind of feel like we should all embrace our inner weirdo.
Well, and question, do you think it also, so I would guess I probably gravitate towards Gonzo more than Kermit recently. And I wonder how much of that is just the consistency in the puppeteering, because obviously losing Jim Henson, Kermit's voice changes and like little aspects of them. They've tried to keep it pretty consistent.
I mean, they've tried, but you've had the same guy doing Gonzo for a long time. I don't know if he's still doing it.
Dave Goelz and do you read it? I don't actually. I read it. Just look that up.
Yeah.
He certainly was that like a few years ago, but
I know, and it is that it might be that consistency because when the voice changes, you sort of switch. Even when Frank Oz stopped doing Miss Piggy, it changes a bit.
Yeah.
All right. Just as we are absolutely coming to a close here. Do you have something coming up? Is there something you're working on that you could talk about?
I haven't, I'm writing like the odd thing here and there that's not going anywhere. I guess I've got a friend it's her very first show. My friend Renata's written something that I'm going to we've done a couple of table reads for it because it's her very first play and I think she just wants to kind of hear it a few times. So I think we're looking at putting that on in the near future. And then I was just in a show right after Fringe, Ryan Ciro. We do an annual, I call it our annual Shakespeare Mad Dash because it's always the weekend after Hamilton Fringe. So you can imagine a lot of rehearsing happens in that 5 days leading up.
I can imagine, but how does anybody have any energy left after Fringe?
I think it's a combination of people you're trying to beat the post-Fringe blues.
Yeah.
The script this year was I Dream of Hamlet. And I think we're hoping to remount that at some point for a wide audience, because we do it out for the Simcoe. It's the Norfolk County Friendship Festival. It's part of we've got some sponsors in Norfolk and then they're really good. The Simcoe community comes up and is really lovely and supportive of it. But I think we're hoping that it has some legs to remount as well. So I think that's all that's going on right now.
Nice. That's great. Well, Liz, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing what you do next.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on. It was nice chatting with you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I really enjoyed that conversation with Liz. I want to take a second to talk about my Patreon, because I can't make this show without the people who've chosen to be patrons of this show. People like Georgia, who backs this episode because they like the work that I do. If you like the work that I do, if you like this show, go to patreon.com/stageworthy and become a patron and help me make this show. Patrons get to be part of the making of the show, you get early access to episodes, and membership is super affordable and in Canadian dollars too. So if you like the show and you want to help me make it, just go to patreon.com/stageworthy and become a patron.